I've chosen to talk to you about an unusual topic, the relationship between economic expertise and what I'll show to be a rich but fraught concept, publicness. The title of the talk is Why Economics Needs the Public, but could easily have been Why the Public Needs Economics. And I hope to convince you that the two questions are bound together. I have the boldest of ambitions for the next 45 minutes. I will argue that thinking about publicness in old and new ways may help us mount a response to what many have described as the crisis of liberal democracy. The core theme of my work has been to study how economics is communicated, as Eric has mentioned, through this 5-year project on the economics in the public sphere. In practice, what I do is read editorial files, I read the correspondence between media professionals and eminent scholars, I collect oral histories, I supplement the study of these actors with text analysis of newsprint. These are the tools of the social historian and of the sociologist. Throughout that time, I've been tempted by an idea for a paper that I never got to write. And the kind invitation of INEM to speak to this conference has given me the chance to do that. Maybe you know the trope that practicing journalists have the unfulfilled fantasy of taking a break from the grind of reporting, renting a seaside bungalow, stock up on red wine, release themselves of facts and current affairs, and write a novel. The immodest equivalent for someone like me is to release myself of archives and propose something more speculative, a piece that is dangling somewhere between sociology, philosophy, and the history of ideas. This talk is in 3 parts. Part 1 is about a short 235-year-old essay. Part 2 is about a debate between America's foremost public philosopher and its foremost academic philosopher. And part 3 is about economists' reputation. Now that is the enigmatic version of the talk's plan. A more transparent one, but less fun, is to say part 1 introduces a conception of publicness, part 2 addresses some objections to this conception, and part 3 spells out why this matters for economics. About that essay. It was the later work of Michel Foucault that teased me to read what many have described as a little essay with a vast shadow. The essay was published in 1784 in a periodical, the Berlinische Monatsschrift. Its author was Immanuel Kant, and the title was An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? It is a famous essay, not at all forgotten or obscure text. It's on the reading lists of high school and undergraduate curricula, and there are several editions and conflicting translations. Just before his untimely death, Foucault had arranged for a seminar to be held at Berkeley with several heavyweights, including Jürgen Habermas, to discuss what is enlightenment. That meeting never took place because Foucault passed away, but his paper to that seminar was published posthumously and is widely read and cited. What is so special about Kant's essay? Among the body of Kantiana, the essay is unusually accessible in language. It is also bold in its claims. Foucault discusses it at length in 3 different occasions and draws different messages from it each time. One line of interpretation is to see the essay as encapsulating Kant's program of critique, or of critical reason. The essay was published in between the 2 editions of the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, and before the groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, and the 2 other critiques, the Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of Judgment. Another line of interpretation claims that the essay is the first time a philosopher looked at his own time without subordinating it to some historical teleology. So the present, not in a flow of change, but measured, not subordinated, not in a flow of change, but rather a moment understood in itself. In that same text, Foucault also sees Kant's little essay as defining an attitude of modernity, that attitude being self-invention. There are thousands of papers discussing Kant's little essay, and I found at least 12 articles whose problem is Foucault's reading of that essay. Those essays review how Foucault seemed to be changing his mind about the Enlightenment in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The essays are unanimous in showing that Foucault misreads Kant. Before us is a formidable literature of commentary and analysis, and as far as I can tell, we have exhausted all possible exegetical acrobatics on Kant's essay, so you will not get an original reading from me. Foucault tells us of the essay's exceptionality within Kant's work. I am interested in what the essay gives us conceptually. To do this, I'm persuaded by the analysis of the essay penned by the British philosopher Honora O'Neill. I want to pull out two key claims, not from that essay, not to test and challenge those claims, but to ask what conception of publicness they prescribe. So the first claim is that enlightenment, and that's the answer to the question, is man's release from his minority. And minority inability to use one's own understanding without direction from other. Self-incurred when it's not due to a lack of understanding, but to a lack of resolution and courage. It's a coming of age that expresses itself in an intellectual self-confidence. Kant says it has a motto, sapere aude, dare to know. And there are several ideas packed in these three short sentences. The stress is that the Enlightenment is redemption from a self-imposed subjugation to others' thinking. And the examples that Kant gives are priests, medical doctors, and books. However, it is not a mere affirmation of individualism or self-belief. To see why not, we need the second claim, second set of claims. Those regard Kant's description of the conditions, the type of freedom to practice that understanding that he sees as key to the Enlightenment. So he says the public use of one's reason must always be free. The private use of one's reason may, however, often be narrowly restricted without this particular hindering the process of enlightenment. So at the root of this formulation is Kant's distinction between private and public reason. And he defines public reason as one's own reason, understand the use which someone makes of it as a scholar before the entire public of the world of readers. And private use, that which one may make of reason in a certain civic post or office for which he is entrusted. So what we see is intellectual freedom, but absolute obedience to sovereign, to church, to bureaucracy. Most commentators look at this passage and this essay with this belief. They're right to do so. How can Kant be so naive to think that the cause of enlightenment, which he prescribes as intellectual freedom, could be pursued without civil liberties and the protection of dissent and disobedience? Kant seems to prescribe freedom the wrong way around. We conventionally prize toleration of belief and freedom of consciousness that are personal, private, and we generally accept policing open discourse against hate speech and other dangerous pollutants. So private is free, public is restricted. Why does Kant turn these around? His private is not the personal sense we usually employ. His private are reasons emerging in the execution of a post, a charge. The private, in his sense, are civic roles, offices, the realm of church and state power. Honora O'Neill's explanation is that Kant seeks to establish a realm of reason demarcated from these authorities. The realm of reason, with its bold Latin motto, must accept only its own authority. Were one to impose any restrictions upon it, one would be establishing that there was a power above it. Kant therefore needs to confine church and state authorities to a special kind of reason, where obedience is justified to preserve social order and social function, but without consequence to the practice of human understanding. Kant's term is öffentlich Vernunft. The original text reads, "Der öffentliche Gebrauch seiner Vernunft muss jederzeit frei sein." The public use of one's reason must always be free. My knowledge of German is rudimentary, as you might have gathered from my pronunciation, and maybe for that reason I pause noting that the root of the word is offen, open. Reason in the open. Öffentlich, the adjective, refers to openness, to viewable to all. In German, one also has the noun publicum, with a Latin etymology that denotes audience. Das Publikum has the same use as die public in English, although the concept gets settled into that meaning later in Germany, only in the late 18th century. Kant used both new and old terms to refer to those that can access public reason. De ganzen Publikum der Lesewelt. So Lesewelt is the world of readers, that's the old term. Publikum is the modern, late 18th century term. Kant is not interested in audiences. It is the whole reading public. He wants us to think about types of reason. Öffentliche is the quality of reason. At this point, you're probably thinking, oh no, his whole point is a grammatical one. And it is. But there's more to that. I visit this essay because, like Foucault, I see it unsettling liberalism as we are used to encounter it. It's a good old prompt to think of public and publicness anew. In the written version of this talk, I would contrast this Kantian conception with the account of publicity of Locke, Bentham, Burke. For them, publicity is a means to an end. It provides a test on claims. Through the trials of publicity, truth triumphs and is revealed. For these English authors, individual belief and consciousness are primary, and toleration, defined as non-interference and non-censure, is the key political requirement. Kant and those building on his work are not interested in freedom of expression, but rather on communication. Communication requires that parties give reasons and subject each other's reason to scrutiny. Communication demands acknowledgement and engagement. The ideas to carry forward from part one are as follows. To think about publicness ought not to lead us to think about the public, das Publikum. I've not explained why I find that sort of objectionable. We can discuss this later. But in short, I think it leads us to concentrate on persuasion and effect. It forecloses genuine communication and dialogue. Linked to this, our attention need not be drawn to freedom of expression as the fundamental principle guiding our civic lives. Publicness can be conceived in substantive grounds as a quality of reason that affords communication and intellectual affirmation, even emancipation. Reason made public is neither persuasion nor expression, but reason that is apt for communication, that welcomes participation and criticism, that encourages the exertions of understanding. At this point, we have something like a conception of publicness, very sketchy one. Distinct types of reason, intellectual self-determination, unrestrained freedom to publish, regulative ideal of universalism. I'm sure you're thinking of various objections to this constellation of concepts, and I hope to hear those in discussion. I too have my own misgivings and worries, and I'll raise two objections to this conception. Is this vision of the empire of reason not unreasonable? An empire of reason set outside of any authority than itself, is that not fundamentally dehumanizing, asocial, and ahistorical? A barren landscape that no one but a handful of university professors would care to live in? The enlightened man, and it is a man, although some translations now put it as enlightened person, in Kant's 1784 essay, is a book writer addressing a reading world as a scholar. This is a formidably elitist picture. Is this account bound to a narrow membership? Is this account of openness so closed that it becomes self-contradictory? Foucault is typically not seen as an influential interpreter of Kant's project of critical reason, but Foucault picked up the 1784 essay in a dialogue with one of these influential interpreters, Jürgen Habermas. Habermas, unlike Theodor Adorno and Marx Horkheimer, is favorable to the Enlightenment's democratic aspirations and its political dreams of reason. You'll have noticed that this talk draws on my reading of some canonical works, and the text of Habermas I would like to call upon. You will not be surprised. This is his habilitation thesis of 1962, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. The term in Habermas's title that is translated into public sphere is Öffentlichkeit. Öffentlichkeit. So Habermas' public sphere is a historical analog to what Kant envisaged in his essay. Given my first objection, what matters most in Habermas' account are what animated the public sphere and who were the occupants of this sphere of critical reason, of critical rationality, critical reason. So what animated it? It began as a literary sphere. Commercial capitalism turned philosophical and literary works of art and works of art into cultural products distributed by the market. And as commodities, these became in principle accessible. By the 17th century, the publisher had replaced the patron as the commissioner of literary works. Discussion became the way consumers of culture appropriated art. The concert, the theater, museums were created and institutionalized to facilitate the lay judgment of art. What framed this criticism was partly emulation. The art of critical debate modeled itself after the elegant courtly world. It was also guided by the private experiences and subjectivity of the conjugal family's intimate domain, the bourgeois family. The dialectic of a public and private spheres in mutual reconstitution during this period. This comes to account for the taste of the period. So this is the first bestseller of 1740, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. The reason many of you might not have read it is because it's a terrible text. It was intended as a way of modeling letter writing, so for the private sphere, right, instructing the bourgeois family how to write elegant letters, but it has a story linking, allowing these letters to breathe, and as a result becomes the first novel. That story becomes the point, the interesting aspect that people come to regard and comment and enjoy and appreciate. So that's the origins, but as soon as the private, and I'm reading a quote, as soon as the privatized individuals and their capacity as human beings, so imagine themselves as a part of a collective called womanhood, cease to communicate merely about their subjectivity, about novels and art and theater, but rather in their capacity as property owners, they desired to influence public power in their common interests. The humanity of the literary public sphere served to increase the effectiveness of the public sphere in the political domain. The public sphere of the world of letters is converted into a sphere of criticism of public authority. The bourgeois soon claimed the public sphere regulated from above against the public authorities themselves, to engage them in a debate over the general rules governing relations in the sphere of commodity exchange and social labor. You will not be surprised to know what was the issue: taxes. That is one of the primary motivators of transforming the sphere of letters into a sphere of political activity and critical rationality. What held this sphere together? It is plain that Kant was mistaken about the first claim mentioned earlier. Enlightenment did not come about as a series of individual acts of intellectual self-confidence, spreading by example and by print. Rather, it came to be through new forms of sociability: salons, coffee houses, reading clubs, where public culture, where print culture circulated and was nurtured, where critical discourse was practiced and modeled. I'll leave the quote here if you wish to read it. From the remote vantage point of Prussia's Königsberg, Kant's conception of Enlightenment was that of the Republic of Letters, of the network of scholars whose debate was held together through correspondence and book writing. Habermas shows that a different model was at play as the 16th and 17th century merchant capitalism reworked the circulation of culture and remade the spaces of privateness and publicness. So far from dehumanizing, the empire of reason, the actual empire of reason that emerged in the 18th century, had its roots in spaces of aesthetic critique and in the tradition of humanism. If you can take this to be an answer to that first objection, the actual Öffentlichkeit, and I would expect any instantiation of publicness, cannot sustain itself on the pursuit of reason and self-enlightenment alone. It must exist within determinate forms of sociability and subjectivity that are suitable for its cultural and historical place. The advent of the public sphere is, of course, not the structural transformation that Habermas speaks of in his title. The structural transformation is the dismantling of this public sphere by the re-feudalization of the public space and the intertwining of state and society. And thus we come to my second objection. The public sphere of the 18th century never expanded beyond an elitist project. Maybe not as elitist as Kant conceived it, which was made up only of scholars, but elitist because made of bourgeois, primary men, and a few women. So there is a debate about whether the public spheres have existed and whether there was beyond this bourgeois public sphere, there was also a plebeian public sphere in relation to it. But I won't discuss that here. To me, the question to ask is, can critical rationality ever be inclusive and expansive? And must it always exclude the majority of the people? Here we must part ways with Kantiana and turn to a different canon. I want to draw from a debate between America's foremost public philosopher and America's foremost academic philosopher. A debate that occurred by way of books addressed to the world of readers. Fresh out of his service in World War I as a communications officer, the journalist, columnist Walter Lippmann authored a book called Public Opinion. The book remains one of the must-read texts in journalism studies. Lippmann argues that the average citizen can never be invested enough, informed enough, and intelligent enough to have a say on major issues of the day, notably in state policy. He justifies his view by noting the unbridgeable distance between the average citizen and events that happen away from their experience, in the fields of combat in France, and more generally in rooms where decisions are made. The book has many, many examples from the public relations war, of gossip, of spin orchestrated by French generals, to whom Lippmann was an aide. In the book, Lippmann reviews the long American tradition and a long liberal tradition of distrust of public opinion, a tradition that goes all the way to the Founding Fathers and the lines drawn by Jefferson and Hamilton. Lippmann's way out is a technocratic fix, a social science utopianism. He believes that a better political science, taking account of social psychology, could be the right hand of government. Lippmann wants a body of civil servants, of scholars, to make the world intelligible to those that need to make the decisions. And this is what the quote here refers to: creation of an intelligence bureau as an instrument of the man of action, intended not to burden every citizen with expert opinions on all questions, and that central agency would thus have the makings of a national university with well-paid jobs, guaranteed retirement, to ensure that some eyes open up. It'd be a great idea to ensure the loyalty of these intellectuals. To put it in the most direct terms, Lippmann believes that because of the opinion of the public, the mass public, openness must be carefully managed. Instead, social scientists, those that could have useful knowledge of the world, should hold court with politicians and advise on the best course of action. The solution of secrecy, or at least of privileged access to power, was not one envisaged by the framers of the American Republic. But it was a position that Henry Sedgwick and John Stuart Mill had defended for utilitarianism. It is well known that for them, for the utilitarians could justifiably lie about their designs, provided this was conducive to acceptance of their policies for a greater good. It was closet paternalism. This was also a position that the Fabians accepted, and I think it's from the Fabians that Lippmann is taking this. He's a reader of Graham Wallas, and Graham Wallas's book, The Great Society, is in the background to this debate. John Dewey did not accept Lippmann's pessimism, or the privilege given to the social science technocrats. Dewey's The Public and Its Problems has been many times read in journalism and communication schools as a response to Lippmann's Public Opinion and to the follow-up, The Phantom Public. And Dewey does have a long footnote thanking Lippmann for his books and for bringing this issue to light, or these questions to light. So it is a plausible connection to make. Dewey begins his book by dismantling the standard account of the state as an emanation of public opinion. He rejects the natural rights tradition and instead upholds a kind of externalities theory of the public. Transactional relationships between individuals and groups are primary, but when these have consequences that go beyond those groups, control becomes necessary. And so does the state. When actions expand beyond transactional actors, they call the public into being. That's Dewey's argument. Like Lippmann, he does not think highly of the quality of public discussion and does not think highly of the layperson's understanding of current affairs. I see Dewey here building from a rich tradition of the Chicago School of Sociology and American institutionalism. That is the thread of ideas that, going back to Edward Ross, sees as the principal agenda of social science to puzzle over the disruptions caused by modernity. The theme of social control, if you know that literature. Disruptive growth of industry, technology, and mass culture, creating tensions, discoordination within aspects of society, between material culture, religion, the polity. This is a rich theme in Veblen's work and in the work of Ogburn, Park, and others. And that's sort of what the examples are meant to show, sort of all the new technologies, the urban space, transformations in the urban space. Faced by this rapid change in economy and material culture, the people is in turmoil, confused about what ails them. Durkheim's anomie is not so different from what Dewey is describing, a state of unrest and confusion towards modern life. But Dewey, unlike Durkheim, thinks that there is a political answer. He calls that a method, not a solution. The method is to create new kinds of associations that link scholars and the people. Together, they may articulate a consciousness of the problems faced by the great society and transform that great society into a great community. What might we conclude from this part? The public is not a starting point of publicness. The public has no agency. Every one of these authors agrees on this. Publicness, the capacity to make ideas and reasons public, relies on an infrastructure of sociability. That's the Habermas argument, and Dewey's language, these are called associations, so he also agrees with this picture. And that infrastructure is patterned after beliefs of what is private and public. The public is a possible accomplishment, but not an inevitable one, of publicness and of open reason. The public comes into being as an imagined community of grievances that call policies for social control, policies of social control. Shall I say that again? I'm going to say that again. The public comes into being as an imagined community of grievances that call for policies of social control. Okay, so by the end of part 2, we have in Lippmann and Dewey contrasting designs for social scientists' role in democracy. So Lippmann sees them as eminent intelligences of public policy, aids of policymakers. Dewey sees them as aids to the formation of the public and as giving language to self-discovery. Beyond this dualism, social science has had a historical role to play shaping the structures of the public sphere. Lippmann's negative outlook of the public's opinion was predicated on social psychology. Psychologists have analyzed at length how stereotypes put blinders on people's eyes. In various guises, that tradition is with us today. Behavioral economists, please stand up. More important still, social scientists have established their authority by claiming to be spokespersons for the public. This thing we call the economy does not sing without economists to give it a voice. We are told that it does not exist in anyone's mind. We cannot just go and ask people how the economy is doing. The economy is an analytic object created by measurement and by the performative policies of national income accounts, corporate financing, and industrial planning. We know that the images of the public broadcast by social science are powerful. Foucault's life work is about this nexus of knowledge, power, and personhood. The point I am making is that social science is not removed from this picture. It was a central character in what Habermas has called a refeudalization of the public sphere, turning passive mass public into an object of study. The people does become actable at a distance through social science methodologies of surveying and experiment. In the jargon of Bruno Latour, social science has become an obligatory point of passage for knowledge of the mass public, categorizing it in intricate fashion to target messages and induce behavioral response, categorizing it as patterns of interests to inform policymaking. What role might there be for social science, given all the things I've said just now? What role might there be for social science in a sphere of publicness that is a state of self-discovery and of becoming? It is at this point, somewhat late in the talk, that I want to talk about crisis. I began researching for this talk thinking that I would discuss a crisis of economics, but the more I read, the more I was drawn to a more pressing concern, a crisis of liberal democracy. In the past 2 years, post-Trump, post-Brexit, a slew of books have appeared from Anglo-Saxon authors speaking of an end to liberal democracy. You may have seen some of these books with titles like Why We Get the Wrong Politicians, Nervous States, The People versus Democracy, The Road to Unfreedom. And just in case those titles are too subtle, we have titles like How Democracy Ends and How Democracies Die. These books share common themes that one gets also from the thinking press, in this case the news magazine press. And I think it's useful to think of a triangle, and this is how many of these discussions have occurred. Think of a triangle where you have the intellectual elites, the power governing elites, and the mass public. And the distance between these seem to be widening. Economists are without doubt one of the more conspicuous examples of the intellectual elite. When in the final stages of the Brexit campaign, Michael Gove, currently the Vice Prime Minister of the UK, said in an interview that the British people had had enough of experts. So this is the interview where Gove says this country has had enough of experts with organizations with acronyms. He gets interrupted. The interviewer doesn't seem to believe, are you really saying this? And then he kind of claims that this is Trump, Oxbridge Trump. And Gove ends, it's a faith, Faisal, in the British people to make the right decision, to not to listen to these experts. He meant economists. The experts Gove is talking about are economists and their post-referendum forecasts. Those forecasts, like the forecasts of America post-Trump, have yet to come true. Instead of those public numbers, the Leave campaign came up with its own creative accounting. Maybe you've heard about numbers painted on a bus. Maybe you don't trust Gove. Maybe you don't trust Gove to have the pulse of a nation. I certainly don't. But there are other possible informants on this matter of the public's trust of experts. The UK polling agency, Ipsos Mori, has since 1983 been asking the following question. I will read out a list of different types of people. For each, would you tell me whether you generally trust them to tell the truth or not? Year on year, the top 4 are unchanged. First, nurses, then doctors, all about 90%, then teachers, then judges, all in the high 80s. In 2016, the year of the Brexit referendum, and only that year, one item on the list was economists. This is where they landed. So column 1, people saying answer, tell the truth, not tell the truth, don't know. The polled would trust a random passerby to tell them the truth 65% of the time, but an economist to only be truthful 48% of the time. The polled would trust the ordinary person to lie 29% of the time, but economists to lie 45% of the time. That's staggering. That's 50-50. The British public just doesn't know what to make of these economists. I don't know how robust these numbers are or how they compare internationally. I've yet to find similar surveys elsewhere. If you know of any, please share. This is Ipsos Mori. I can share the link in the slides. We can drill a bit deeper into the layperson's sentiment about economists by looking at a survey done with funding by ING and run by the Economics Network, a group of British economists who advocate for a greater public understanding of the discipline. Their 2017 online poll concluded that people are skeptical of economics but would like to learn more. And this is the take-home message of the report in the summary. And this insight is supported by the data. So one thing they've discovered is over 60% of the population of the polled have never studied economics, but about 55% would be interested in, would support it being taught in the general curriculum in schools. I don't know the conditional probability of this. I don't know if it's whether more likely to ask for economics to be taught if you've actually studied it or not. But the number to me seems not an overwhelming consensus, but a useful finding for an advocacy group that wants to see the discipline more widely taught. That is how the report writers want you to remember the study, but there are other things in the study that I find more interesting. The survey finds that people are worried about personal finance. It's one of the core themes that people want to talk about and want to see economics address. But the questions asked are of the kind, do you think the government should or should not listen to the advice of economists regarding, for example, the national and global economy? Happily, when it comes to the matter of this thing called the national and global economy, respondents of all ages say economists should be heard. And that's the graph, top graph there. It's hard to think how they would respond otherwise if the economy cannot be thought without economists to read it. And yet, despite this show of respect, ask the question, to what extent do you trust the opinions of economists on issues regarding the national and global economy? And we're back to a coin toss. Trust a fair amount, 32. Don't trust very much, 31. Two insights stand out to me. While there is an absence of trust in economics, measured by an inability to sway 50% of the population to trust them to tell the truth, we have no reason to believe that economics is in a crisis. The student enrollments are robust, among the best at my university. Economists' employment and wage profiles are outstanding within the social sciences, within any field. The place of economists within key institutions of government, business, and finance is unchallenged. In sum, being distrusted by the populace does economists no harm. They are just fine. 2, the public predicament is to some extent not specific to the discipline. The literature on public understanding of science finds very similar patterns. So on that Ipsos Mori survey, indeed, people did not nearly distrust the scientists as much as the economists. They trusted scientists far more, but some patterns are similar. So in surveys, ask people if they want more science education. Most people say yes. Ask people if government should listen to scientists. Of course it should. Those goofy politicians need all the help they can get. But then ask people if they trust scientists on specific issues and policies, like a proposed ban on fishing sardines, and people go, these scientists, they can be so alarming, and they make mistakes. Maybe sardines is not a good example. It just denounces my Portuguese heritage. My suggestion, which I'm sure you'll want to challenge, is that there might be no crisis of expertise, no crisis in the legitimacy of experts, but there might be a crisis of expert reason. And how do I split these? I think they can be distinguished. There is no crisis of expertise because experts are still in high demand, because they're still necessary for the functioning of our polities, our economies. The legitimacy of experts refers to their symbolic and cultural authority, and as we've seen, by convention, tradition, or laziness, we may not dispute that experts know something we don't, and governments should listen to them. So that they might still have a cultural authority, despite what Gove might say. But their authority need not extend to accepting the course of action plotted by the experts, once these proposals become open to examination and debate. Returning to the concepts I've been building here, currently economist interventions are not enabling a public to discover itself. They are not in communication. Maybe talking at the lay, but not talking to the lay and with the lay. Yesterday we heard about tractability. The concept I think would be useful here was the accessibility, the ability of the public to assess the reasons of economists. Economists are not reasoning in accessible, publicizable ways. They write for themselves for peer assessment. To the outside world, they translate their conclusions. They talk of these translations with utter disdain. They are caricatures, or more harshly, they bastardize the beautiful argument for public presentation and persuasion. They play the media. These are how the way economists talk about the public space. Once upon a time, Lippmann's solution might have worked. And apologies for offering the grotesque illustration of Lippmann's account, which is the Chicago boys, here seen in the 1950s, being sociable before they were influential. Hiding intellectual elites from view to advise decision makers, and then let the decision makers justify the actions by whatever means necessary, would be a good strategy if people trusted politicians. The lowest creatures in the hierarchy of trust are politicians, journalists and government officials who are expected to tell the truth less than 20% of the time, and lie between 70 and 80%. The recent breed of what Time magazine calls strongmen don't seem even tempted to play that game anymore. We could hope for a new republic of letters that's seeking autonomy from the current fray and its ideological agonism might build the foundations for a new culture of cosmopolitanism and justice, social justice. Maybe something interesting would be born of it. That would be Kant's 1784 model, but I have been slowly working away from that model this morning. If our democracies are in the process of polarization, we need to find new reasons that can bring us together, that can help us imagine ourselves as a public, as one public. What better topic to reason than our material lives? If we are able to extend our field of vision to encompass a planet on the verge of catastrophe and the creeping inequality that is feeding anxiety and resentment, articulating these problems together may bring a public into being. To achieve this, we need new associations and forms of sociability, where lay and expert can reason together and critically. The humblest solution is to participate in social movements, join social movements. You'd be surprised to know that throughout history, economists have done this, except we don't have very good histories of these engagements. We don't think enough of how rich that engagement can be. I don't think I have examples to talk about. I have time to talk about examples, but I could in discussion if you wish. The retro-antiquarian solution is book writing. Economists like to claim an ancestry to political economy. To Habermas, the physiocrats are the great example of the critical rational discourse of the emerging public sphere in France, but the physiocrats are also preempting the closure of that public sphere. We can go back further to the discourse of merchants, men of letters, philosophers, and how that discourse appeared in pamphlets, books, and periodicals and was read and discussed in coffee houses. Books. The book is not yet dead. Its death has been greatly exaggerated. The digital sphere remains unsettled. Most people seem to accept that the purview of creating new forms of communication should rest in the hands of techies and venture capitalists, who want nothing other than monetize their harvesting of our data and sell us advertising. After an euphoria about the inherent possibilities of the internet, of a network society, in Manuel Castell's terms, we are now in the most frightening of pessimisms, as we discover that the agoras have turned out to become echo chambers, and amplifiers of fake news and hate speech. The history of newsprint is illustrative of the ways that means of communication have been claimed and repurposed. Newsprint was first an outgrowth of commerce in the 15th and 16th century. Publishers then saw an opportunity to sell digests and compilations of those news to a wider public and turned news into a mass commodity in the 17th century. Then it was nationalized as a useful tool for absolute monarchs. And only then was it reappropriated by a democratic public sphere. Digital could have a similar convoluted career. These are conservative and not very imaginative proposals. I know that. But getting at a better set of proposals is a research problem. We not usually think of conditions of publicness or accessibility. All I want to convince you is that maybe we should. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very interesting talk. My question is about your conclusion about what economists not communicating in a way that's intelligible to the public. Part of that, no doubt, comes from how economists are rewarded in their careers. That one could argue that speaking to the public or speaking in a more accessible way is a public good, which, like most public goods, are not automatically done at the appropriate levels. And so, do you envision any mechanisms for transformation other than just pointing out, the problems?
No, you're absolutely right, and it gets even harder if you start thinking about the economics of print and all these other things that are, of course, all constituted there. So I'm not proposing. I don't think it's reasonable to. I didn't offer you an 11-point program of how to save economics. I don't think that this is This is an appeal on a complete transformation of the discipline. I think it would be enough for a segment, a few people to begin to do this sort of work of engaging the lay. Universities, the university system in the UK, or at least my university, constantly plays out this rhetoric of public engagement, of a need to show the value of what's happening within its halls, and also of seeing this as a way of advertising its programs and things of that sort. So there's a constant pressure for openness, but it's an openness which is very self-serving, which is it's kind of marketing. And one could leverage that because that is rewarded, because that is acknowledged as a professional activity. One could try and leverage that for a different kind of engagement, one that's more civic, one that's more oriented towards political action. Or a new kind of, it doesn't have to be a political action. I think part of this is kind of also a cultural engagement of enabling a lay public to have the confidence to talk about some of these issues in ways that is kind of palatable for a wider, sorry, didn't know what to end there.
Thanks, that was very interesting. But the particular way into the current debate that you took was, I think, useful to explore further. So I want to, last year I, for some reason, went back and read some of Christopher Lasch, and I was interested in particular his late work on critique of the American tradition of progress. And like you, about a third of progress and its problems, or whatever it's called, that
Public and its problems.
Sorry?
You mean Dewey's Public and its problems?
No, sorry, Lasch.
Lasch.
True and Only Heaven was the one.
Yeah.
He also starts with the debate between Lippmann and Dewey, and pulls out a theme that does seem to be importantly prescient with respect to our current problems, but that I didn't come up in your talk, and that is Lasch's line is that where the Dewey program crashed was that the global intellectuals formed a culture of their own, which distanced itself from the particular cultures of people of actual communities.
Mhm.
And given the strength of a kind of populist nationalism, if there's one thing that all of these anti-liberal current political movements seem to have in common, it's parochialism and particularism and concern about others, and there's a strong kind of backlash against the current versions of globalization. And on almost any interpretation I can think of the, whether we're talking about the technocrats or the reformers or progressives or, right, so take the prism from any angle you like. One thing that seems to be pervasive is those communities are much more comfortable talking to each other across communities than they are talking in particular ways with their communities. And you're going to be viewed as a bit of a traitor to the global intelligentsia,
Right.
to the extent that you think we should be giving special pride and place to some local community concerns. And if that's one of the fundamental problems that we have,
Yeah.
and if Lasch is right about, and Lasch of course was writing 40 years ago,
Yeah.
but gee, it could have been written last, that
Absolutely,
part of it
yeah,
could have been written
absolutely,
last year,
yeah.
despite all the other crap of anti-feminist bullshit and so on.
Right.
So I'd be interested in your have you thought about that aspect, or was that just something you didn't have time to work into today's talk?
Right. So one of the things that Dewey says, which I didn't highlight because I'm not sure where I stand with it, is he's a defender of sort of local, of go local, right? You know, act local, as to say, think global, act local kind of thing. Where he says that there needs to be a close connection, association with the lay, a face-to-face. Otherwise, people won't. You know, that bridging of trust needs to be a personal one. And that's the argument of sociability, right? That's the argument that you needed the coffee houses, you needed the salons. You can't do everything by letter writing and book writing. And of course, the global intelligentsia does have that level of sociability. Not just they're meeting in airports, but they meet at conferences. They meet at Davos or whatever. There is a structure of sociability where they have the opportunity to identify with each other while feeling very distant from the person that lives, a kilometer away or whatever in a different neighborhood, but is normally of the same nationality. So this is why I think sort of this issue of imagined communities is so crucial. It's who do you identify with? I don't know how to hack that. I don't know and I'm sure there's not one solution. It happens, right? The social movements case, which is the one I know best because I've done some research on social movements, often by reasons of social justice, people do that leap, and economists who have no connection with these religious groups or activist groups go there and just try and help them with their cause, and as a result, in a very humble way, and as a result, come to change their research agenda, the kind of questions and the kind of things that they do. I don't have as I said, I don't have an 11-point program, but that's definitely one of the obstacles. I don't think it challenges the picture I've drawn. That's how I would put it in my picture.
It's hard to engage with the lay if you discover that one of the first things the lay want to say is, we're happy to listen to you as experts, but by the way, we hate the Poles, and then also the French, and in fact the Scots too. Right? I mean, the engagement becomes very, very.
And then you have to ask, why? Why do you hate them? Give me the reasons.
Thank you. So thank you for the talk, and it picks up aspects of that. I'm really interested, so you've done a great job of discussing the public and where things are going on. What's going on with the private? I mean, so you introduced Kant, and it's very clear, at least in my mind, that public and private in Kant have this weird mutual constitution relationship. Where is that now? I mean, what would be the private here? And I wonder if that's somehow causing some of these problems. Is the private what, say, global scholars would consider parochial, limited, things like this?
So no, I think that's still that's a, yeah, that's kind of a public. I think the private in this, the way I understand it, is the intimate sphere that is not meant for to be viewable, right? So when we think about the private, we'd have to think about the family. We'd have to think about local communities. We'd have to think about enterprise. We'd have to think about the way, you know, sort of the economic social infrastructure and what of those, how those filter the public issues. Have we seen a reconstitution of the private? So what happens with the digital media, I think, is interesting in reconstitution of private spaces, because they're meant to be social media, but what they create is a new kind of privacy, right? And so that's part of the problem of the digital media, is that it's been interpreted as a new agora, but in fact it's doing the opposite. It's refeudalizing with new arrangements, but refeudalizing debate and critical reason.
Jack.
Thanks. I wonder if you could go back to your slide where you did arguments on where not oppressive entities, but not oppressive authority, but oppressive, that one. I want to suggest that maybe you separate out legitimacy and authority, partly because I think that it highlights maybe one of the problems with the crisis of expert reason. So often in political theory, legitimacy is seen as a kind of property of authority, rather than just synonymous with it, where one interpretation in that literature is, of which the democratic kind of legitimacy sees that legitimate authority is authority that is reasoned and justified such that it's acceptable to its subjects over time. So you can have authority that exists without legitimacy, but in that sense it often becomes brittle and it's no longer accepted over time. And that democratic account of legitimacy, reasoning about that authority is really important. And I think that highlights one reason why kind of the crisis of expert reasoning might, even if it doesn't mean it's a crisis of authority, so to speak, now, it signals a possible crisis of authority in the future. Because the hollowing out of expert reason hollows out legitimacy of authority, and therefore leads to the possibility in which that authority can quite easily be swept away in one big movement.
Sure.
Partly what the kind of worry is now.
Okay.
Even though kind of liberal democracy and the experts in liberal democracy are still there, there's a weird hollowing out of their grounding and why they're there, and that could easily be swept away. So I think if you separate out legitimacy from authority, that highlights a further reason why the crisis of expert reason is really important.
I'm convinced. I'll do that. I was when I had symbolic there, I was there was this temptation to go to put symbolic capital and just go a little bit Bourdieu, and I just put authority just to not add another layer to this. But maybe I should go Bourdieu and just say that I'm thinking here about distinction. I'm thinking here about cultural distinction, not about authority in the more substantive sense that you're giving.
Brendan.
Thanks very much. One small point with respect to the translation of the Kant, and it has a rhetorical effect in your presentation that sets Kant up as a little bit more of a villain than he might be.
Sure.
When you translate non-age as minority, right? I mean, it's not minority. It's minority in the sense of underage.
Yeah.
You're a minor, right?
Yeah.
And when you put that with respect to empire and sort of these types of restrictions that Kant imported into what was supposed to be a universal conception of rationality, a Kantian, which I'm not one, might see that as a bit unfair. I'm interested if you've looked at the work of James Bowman with respect to publics and developing the idea of multiple idea of publics, so that Bowman extends. So Bowman is in the tradition of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, but he uses Habermas's idea with Dewey to sort of have a much more friendly idea to how you integrate expert culture with public culture, right? Which is Dewey's whole aim in the public and its problems. And he generates this idea of practical verification, so that you have a certain a dialogue between experts and communities, so that experts get the problem right, which is what Dewey's very concerned with. But experts are also informed by the experiences and sort of the epistemological access the sufferer of a problem might have that the expert doesn't quite have because they're coming in from the outside. It's in From Demos to Demoy. Right? getting a plural idea of the people and a decentered conception of reason. It's just a suggestion because I think it fits very well with some of the.
Thank you. I'll look it up.
Yes, thank you for your talk. My first question is related with your conception of the economy, and whether that conception allows you to understand the roots of the crisis of expert reasons. You have defined the economy as constituted by acts of performativity. And
Yeah.
at least that's
Sure. Yeah.
and of course, if you understand the economy that way, it frames the way you interpret the data. For example, you've mentioned in passing that people, of course, were very much concerned with their private finances, and probably with the public finances also. So, of course, that concern is very much rooted in a very material concern because of the crisis, of stagnation, of over-indebtedness, and that fits in a materialistic way the crisis of expert reason. And you don't have to be a Marxist. You just have to buy, for example, Benjamin Friedman's the moral consequences of economic growth. Of course, when there is stagnation, people mistrust institutions, including very much mainstream economists. So, is there a way in your framework to account for these questions? The second question relates with social movements, and I was wondering where political parties fit in that narrative, because I think political parties are very much under-recognized, an important part of the history of economists as public intellectuals. I mean, for example, Stephanie Mugge's account of how the parties of the left were colonized by neoliberalism relies very much on the crisis of the intellectual, the academic, the expert within left parties. And I think that is a crucial component and perhaps can fit in on your account of the relationship between economists as a public intellectual and political parties and social movements and trade unions more generally. It kind of embedded economies that we don't seem to have right now.
Yeah. So thank you. Didn't want to commit myself to a kind of a sort of performative ontological thesis that the economy doesn't exist without economists. I did drop that there, but my mentions were somewhat at a different level. It was more at the level of discourse and public discourse. The topic of the economy in public discourse occurs through discussions of price indexes, of the national income accounts. You know, this is not. These are not objects that the person on the street or most other professionals other than economists are seen as competent to talk about. So until we talk about the economy as something else, then to me the economy is an object that is monopolized by economic discourse and economic expertise. So I mean in that sense, not in the Timothy Mitchell, Donald Mackenzie sense. Would parties be a good? I don't know. So it's interesting because it never occurred to me to consider parties, and I think it's partly because living in the UK right now, it seems that the Labour Conservative Party are still in the process of disaggregation, and it's total chaos, and you don't want to go there. You just want to see how that sorts itself out, and then maybe you'd consider party engagement. But maybe that's an opportunity. The fact that they're in this process of mental confusion. Maybe this is the time to see them as something other than what they've been in the past, which has been the mechanisms for closing critical rationality, for doing more what Lippmann is talking about, which is to dress up policies in ways that sell them to the mass public.
I wonder what are your thoughts on the implication on education, how we teach economics, right? For example, how we teach undergraduate economics and how we teach economic principles. Are we not actually making the situation worse in terms of teaching people not how to talk to the public, but how to talk at the public, like word economics, right? Are we giving students the methods and the tools to be able to go and talk with or to the layperson
So I've done some work on the history of radical economics. I've done quite a bit of work on the history of radical economics, and one of the things they're passionate about is educating trade unionists and teaching economics to them, teaching economics to social movements. And the idea is that if you give these people the rudiments of what the language is about, they won't be intimidated. They will be able to talk to economists without feeling that they need to defer to their authority. They will see through the jargon, they will see what the basis of that is, they will be able to, it will make the arguments of economists more accessible, less esoteric. So in my mind, I think the economics network is right. You know, more economics education would probably be a good thing. Not the high level stuff that leads towards a career as a PhD economist, but some level of understanding of the concepts, of the types of arguments, of those sorts of things. That would enrich the capacity of the lay, whatever they go on to do, to read, to be interested, to engage critically. So that would be bringing the public closer to the expert discourse, but it would still be producing some of what I'm hoping to get, which is a genuine communication and engagement. About the form of that education, I'm thinking the one that would be useful would be this kind of most simple, low-level one of explaining some of the basic concepts and of economics and basic forms of reasoning, but in a sort of a maybe humanistic, social sciencey way.
I think I have two comments. One is, the first is a sort of follow-up to what Diana said in her first intervention. And I think that in a way we open up a really interesting line of inquiry here, sort of a sub-line of inquiry, which is on institutional analysis and its role in terms of higher education institutions, right? Like how does the institution of the academy impact sort of our behaviors as economists? So I'm thinking as an ag and applied economist from the States, where for 100 years or more, we've actually had a third area of tenure, which is extension and outreach. That you can gain tenure in extension and outreach through those activities, right? That is not normal in most of the rest of the academy. So there are models out there that we can understand and engage in from an institutional analysis standpoint.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, I think sort of related to all of this is also like diversity, right? What's the diversity of economists and thinkers in economics, and how does that play into us being able to ask questions that different communities actually care about and think about and can relate to? The second line is on how we conduct inquiry, and it may be subsumed under that middle thing that you had, on the last slide that you didn't get to the examples. But I'm thinking, social movements and specifically social work, right? Because close encounters are needed. So I'm thinking how we conduct inquiry matters as well, right? The movements towards participatory inquiry and other forms of inquiry that are participatory in nature, at least at some stage in the process of inquiry, versus just we have this data set and we have these theories, may be a really great way to also engage people so that they take ownership. So I see that.
Yeah, I want to just, can I just make a?
I'm sorry, we have a list of people who want to speak, so it'd be great if you could respond to this, and I'll put you on the list if we have time.
I have nothing to respond.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's a wonderful comment. Yeah, I agree with all you said. The only thing I'd comment is that the flow of the discussion is going towards the institutional aspect.
Yeah.
And there's there's more philosophy to be done about exactly what is accessibility, what is the need. I pointed out that what's interesting is that a type of reason that has a sort of communicative potential, and no, we're not talking about that. But not that I have answers to that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on what that evokes. Yeah. Sean.
Yes, thanks. Really interesting presentation. Two quick comments on things that have come up in the Q&A. The one on British political culture, you're probably aware of this, but the engagement between Simon Wren-Lewis and some other economists involved inside of the Labour Party. I mean, you've listened to some stuff about that Wren-Lewis had, which is really interesting on the process of engagement. On the issue of trade unions in South Africa, we have exactly what you're talking about, but it's sort of quite radical Marxist economists training these trade unionists. I think the training they've given them has probably done more harm in the public sphere than good, but that's, we can talk about that. But the more substantive question was that, the concern of my current work is I think the public engagement economists are doing now is harmful. That's my view, and a lot of people disagree. It's not a problem for you because you're proposing a different kind of engagement. But I'm just not clear whether I agree with you or not, because I'm not really sure what progress you envisage will be created by such engagement. And you made an allusion in one of your responses to the research program. So perhaps through economists engaging in social movements, they might change their research program, they might change the kinds of problems that they're looking at. But that presumes that that is a contributor to the broader problem you identify. And I think that could be contested. So I don't know whether either for a specific example or some kind of commitment to the kinds of issues that you're really saying lie behind this problem, because then we could say, okay, the engagement you're talking about would or would not address those issues. But it's just not clear to me.
So to me, this is not an argument. So as I said, economics is fine. There is no crisis of economics. There is a crisis of democracy. So the problem is the fact that we're being polarized, we're being unable to address crucial issues, and partly is because economics is fine. Because economics can go on doing what it's doing and still prosper and enrich itself, have meaningful lives and continue to produce knowledge. Right? That's not the issue. The issue is to illuminate the world. It's to use economics as seen as one of these elitist groups that are seen as disconnected, and use that power, that capacity, to illuminate our material lives and discover a new public. So the problem is a democratic problem. The problem is a polarization of our societies. The problem is democracy and the threat, and the solution is economics.
I completely disagree.
Yeah, thank you. One small, perhaps you have a couple of words on a very big question, which is, what do economists do now in the digital sphere? Like an update of your earlier stuff on bloggers. So do you see any changes? What can you say in the context of this talk? That's one thing. Another thing is, when you were discussing these public sphere issues, and I was thinking about, I was trying to juxtapose this with the community, with what we know about the community of economists. And what we know is that there were strong tendencies to depoliticize science of economics, much stronger than in other social sciences, to eliminate any activism from some kind. And the tendency is quite strong. That's one thing. And another thing, a model of sociability, which also emerged in the German tradition, and that's called geistiges Tierreich in German, the spiritual animal kingdom, where people struggle, where they compete, where they struggle for mutual recognition, and which is also very typical for any intellectual community, but also for the community of economists. So how would this influence their ability or inability to engage with the public? Third, what do you make of Fourcade et al.'s thesis that basically the more influential economists are, the more accountable they might be because they are influential and they take more responsibility. And there might be more accountability connected to this responsibility in society. And fourth, there is a bit of work in experimental economics on lay people attitudes, so they try to engage with that hypothetically later.
Ivan, this is too much, man. Where do I start? There are like 5 things. So about the digital sphere, I've done a little bit of work on blogging. I try to do a little bit of work on economist blogging, but I haven't kept up. So sometime in 2010, I stopped tracking what was going on there. I tried to do a bit of work on Twitter, and it wasn't very successful. My sense is that it's not so different from other sciences. There's a few notable. So I think what's shaping those digital spaces tend to be subordinate to the more traditional media structures, media conglomerates, etc. So the people that get visibility are the people that get quoted in the mainstream media, and so their position is amplified. So the way that is being structured does not seem so different from other fields and does not seem to be disruptive of a sort of kind of media controlled, media driven, print media driven, you know, conventional media driven, and doesn't have to be print. So I've not seen anything that surprising. The thing that everyone talks about is Vox. That so isn't it amazing? But I've yet to see why it's so amazing. It's a syndicated system of opinion, of issuing opinion. It's great for newspapers in peripheral countries to get opinion from top academics, but I'm yet to see how does that constitute other than a sphere for the accountable ones, as you mentioned. So the people on the top of their career. That kind of accountability is interesting and important in the state of current things, but I'm talking something way more grassroots, where you don't have to be a Nobel Prize economist to do the kind of work that I'm thinking, which is the kind of work of engaging, empowering the lay to use their own reason, to think critically, to use maybe some of the tools of economics, but also to bring their own tools into discussions of our material lives. And as a result, create a kind of communication, create a kind of a new type of discourse. And I'm being very conservative with this. I'm saying that's not competitive with a bunch of other things that are happening in the discipline and the things the discipline is doing. So this would be on the side of that. And the consequences of that, maybe there are broader consequences, methodological and others, but I can't envision what those might be. What I'm worried is about the arrogance of expertise and the way that is essentially possibly excluding economic reasons and economic traditions and economists from a clash or elimination of the authority of experts in some places. I don't think this would happen everywhere. And just for delaying some things that need to be done with climate change, with inequality.
Time is up. I'm sorry to those of you who wanted to ask questions, we didn't have time to do so. We're having coffee now for the next half hour, but before that, please join me